The Mosquito Coast is rated 6.6 on IMDb. Call the police. Call the Army. Call the Coast Guard. It should be rated at least twice that, I think. At least 13 out of 10. I'll tell you exactly why it should be, and I'll tell you why it isn't, too. But first I want to start with some trivia, because this movie actually has a lot of interesting little things about it. The Mosquito Coast came out in 1986. That's right, an American movies from the 80s on this channel. It's directed by Peter Weir, that's why. It's only a second Hollywood film, actually. It stars Harrison Ford, who was also in Peter Weir's first Hollywood film, which was Witness, which was quite successful commercially and critically. The Mosquito Coast also stars Helen Mirren, and one of the only child actors, one of the few child actors in history who isn't terrible. In fact, I think he's good, great even. That's River Phoenix is in this movie, does a great job. We also get a small appearance from Jason Alexander, when he still has hair, sort of. This movie has Andre Gregory in it. What a lovely surprise. If you haven't seen My Dinner with Andre, you should check that out. This movie also was Butterfly McQueen's last film appearance. The screenplay for The Mosquito Coast was written by Paul Schrader, a writer with a bit more cachet than the average guy working in the 80s. It was based on a book by Paul Theroux. Haven't read the book, don't know if it's good. The music is done by Maurice Jarre, although it's really not that notable and kind of just sounds like the 80s. Clearly, though, this is a great cast and a great group of people working on what turns out to be a great movie. So was it a success like Witness? No. It was actually a flop when it came out, barely making half of what it cost to produce. This film was shot partially on location in Belize, by the way. It's not some over-the-top blockbuster where they throw the budget in your face, but they are committed to the story. It's not a low-budget film either. It couldn't have been cheap to make, and they didn't recoup most of these costs. Apparently, Jack Nicholson was originally supposed to play Ali Fox, the main character, but he dropped out when he learned that he couldn't watch NBA games in Belize. Who knows if that's really true? I suspect it isn't, but Harrison Ford took his place and is very different from Jack Nicholson, but in some ways the original casting would have made some sense. The film's pivotal character, this Ali Fox, is an engineer and an iconoclast. Bold, independent thinker, but also a conspiracist, teetering between good things like inspiration, brilliance, vision, and not so good things like insanity. Tired of life in sort of the mainstream America and convinced of an impending nuclear catastrophe, Ali takes his family to live in the jungles of Mosquito, a fake Caribbean country. They spend quite a while drifting down rivers, and immediately some of the great river movies come to mind. River Phoenix, fittingly in the film. Fitzcarraldo, perhaps. Aguirre, The Wrath of God. Apocalypse. Now even throw in a pinch of the Poisonwood Bible. I guess that's a book. Was there a movie? I don't even know. And a sprinkle of Running on Empty, the movie, not the song. And you've got The Mosquito Coast. Ali is remarkably driven, and as you can guess, this leads to some problems. Like I said, this kind of character isn't that far off from Jack Nicholson in some ways. It's not that far from The Shining, even. But ultimately, I think Nicholson wouldn't have really pulled it off as well as Harrison Ford does. Certainly the movie would have been darker. Jack Nicholson would have leaned more towards the lunatic side, I think, from the very beginning. I'm not sure the balance would have been as exquisite as it is with Harrison Ford. Harrison Ford, a reliable guy, makes an Ali Fox that is genuine, altruistic, kind, a character you can really get behind at times. Now, from the beginning, Ali seemed at least a little bit unhinged, but some of his ideas about alternative living really are potent. Self-sufficiency, rejection of consumerism, that's a big one. Movie opens showing sort of strip mall America with Ali complaining about it, and that is a potent thing to complain about. Although Ali is cynical and probably thinks too much of himself, his theory do strangely seem to come from a place of love, empathy, community, acceptance. And you can see ways in which he is even a great father. But this all really hangs in the balance. And as we watch the movie, we spend most of the time waiting for the other shoe to drop. We've heard this story before about the family going to the jungle, thinking it will be easy to make a life there. A bold, optimistic father leading them on, and we're just sort of waiting for things to go wrong. It's inevitable that they will. One thing that Peter Weir has always been great at, I think, is knowing how to balance these sort of archetypical elements, these Hollywood things that we're all familiar with, the stories that we know the ending to, with new ideas, twists, unexpected things, and subtlety. And so while the sense of impending disaster structures the movie and gives the audience a foothold, something to latch onto, the way that things unfold actually isn't what you might expect. And sure, there are some inevitable components of the movie, but things end up going a little bit differently and end up being much more subtle than you might predict. This is one of the places where you can really tell that the movie comes from a book. The Mosquito Coast turns out to be a subtle film, yes, and also an episodic film. There are some common threads throughout the movie, but the story takes us more places than you might expect. This movie is a lot bigger than I expected it to be. I thought, hey, family goes to the jungle, they set up a camp, things go awry, and that's it. But in fact, there's a lot more to this. Literally, just a lot more things happen in this movie, and I think that's definitely a strength. Wasn't what I was expecting. Let me talk a little bit about the technical stuff. One of the most striking things about the movie is how vivid things look. It's kind of hard to pin this down. The movie doesn't have any really fancy cinematography. It has a nice, really concise cuts where the family's waving goodbye to the United States. They're all cheery and happy, and then it cuts straight to the ship tossing and turning in the waves. Nice little edit. There's a couple things like that. But in general, the style of this movie doesn't hit you over the head. Nonetheless, it looks really clean for some reason. I think partly this comes down to the colors in the movie, which are really bold. There's also a healthy amount of handheld photography, a lot of shots that give us dynamics without really making themselves noticed. We also, I think, might be skewed a little bit more towards tighter shots in this movie, which isn't uncommon in Peter Weir films. And there's some nice tactile imagery, too. Shots that you can really feel, characters touching stuff. Overall, like I said, this movie doesn't look fancy, but it pops. It just feels really dynamic, really vivid cinematography, which is cool. I touched a little bit already on the acting. In general, it's great. I think it's really one of Harrison Ford's better roles. Helen Mirren is a little see-through in the film. Her character maybe could be a bit stronger in some ways. I'll come back to this. River Phoenix, like I said, is great. In the beginning of the film, his character is closely allied with his father, which makes him kind of annoying. But don't mistake this for bad acting. River Phoenix ends up being quite dynamic in this movie. An interesting piece of trivia about me is that my father once sold a car to River Phoenix. River Phoenix grew up with his own alternative lifestyle. He didn't really go to school. Instead, he and his sister would busk on the street as his family roamed across the country. So this movie about a family traveling on their own path may have really resonated with him, much like the later Running on Empty that I mentioned before, in which River Phoenix plays the son of a couple that is on the run for having blown up a chemistry lab a few decades earlier. That's a phenomenal movie. By the way, these are both movies that are in some ways reckoning with the wake of the 1960s. This is a complicated thing, a complicated legacy. Parents clinging onto ideals, but at what cost? Parents defiantly leading alternative lives. But does it work with a family? And what happens to rebellious parents when their kids start to rebel against them? In many ways, this is a glum story, given that the 1980s, more than anything else, I think, marked a return to the mainstream domestication of earlier wild ideas. At least that's the narrative that gets put out. Maybe it's more complicated. It probably is. It can be tough to live anywhere other than the mainstream. It can cost you. River Phoenix died of an overdose when he was 23. That's a complicated story too, but it's a grim outlook for a child of a flower child. This isn't a main narrative of this movie exactly, but just behind the surface, there seems to be some story, some undercurrent of the 1980s and some of Ali's ideologies, some of the independence makes you wonder about, like I said, the wake of the 60s. Anyway, I said I would tell you why this movie wasn't very well received. I think part of why it may have been is that the film was really marketed the wrong way. The Mosquito Coast was pitched to audiences as another Harrison Ford adventure. Another, not meaning another version of The Witness, but more like another version of Indiana Jones. This movie is nothing like Indiana Jones, although it does have a fair amount of action in it, and it's actually one of the more gripping and accessible movies that I've talked about recently. Nonetheless, it's another case of mistaken identity in film marketing. Not only are there no whips in this movie, but like I said, it isn't a light, simple adventure. It's a big movie, and it's a movie that you realize pretty early on is going to take a lot of energy to watch. Not like a depressing movie, exactly. Not like a harrowing movie, exactly, but an unrelenting movie in some ways. You realize when you start that you're biting off a lot to think about. You're biting off a lot to be invested in. In general, I think Peter Weir makes accessible films, and this is another one, but it's a movie where the wrong expectations could really sabotage you, because it turns out to be a quite serious movie and a fairly demanding movie to watch. It's not hard to see how that could really be pleasant for some people who went into the theater thinking they would get another Raiders of the Lost Ark or something like that. Okay, so those are the basics of the movie. There's a few things to think about maybe under the surface a bit. Like most Peter Weir movies, this isn't exactly an art film, but it has real substance and it has a lot of subtlety, a lot of observations. Some of my favorite moments in the film are watching Ali's fleeting self-awareness. You can see some of the times when he is more extreme, when he puts the hammer down, when he becomes more paranoid, that he also, in the back of his mind, some piece of him seems to know that he's hurting his loved ones. And even when things really kind of get out of hand, you can see that there is some kind of love somewhere inside him. I don't mean this as a defense. I just like that the character has layers, and I really like that there are flashes of deep uncertainty, which is kind of the antithesis of what Ali stands for. Ali is an eternal optimist. He always has an idea. He always has conviction. That strength of his conviction and his ideas is what drags his family out into the jungle. It's what gets the locals bought into him building this village. It's really the dynamo of the little society they put together. It's his leadership there by just being this driving, optimistic, visionary force. And yet, as things go on, you can see that he starts to get a little bit tied up. He starts to find himself in positions where his ideals, which are rock solid, his convictions, which he needs to believe in, to exist, take him to places that he doesn't exactly want to be. Take him to places that don't totally make sense to, like I said, put the hammer down on his family, his children. And you can tell that it eats him up in a way, and you can tell that he doesn't exactly know what to do. For this character who is so certain, these moments of uncertainty are really powerful. They're my favorite thing about this movie, I think. His wife, Helen Mirren's character, is kind of the opposite of this. She never really has much conviction. She has a deep connection with Ali and wants to follow him. Today's audiences might find this character to be a little bit too passive, too weak, but I think it alludes to one of the underlying structures of the movie, which is trust. When Ali first tells the family that they're going to leave the U.S., leave their house, pack up, we're hitting the road, there isn't much objection from them. This might seem a little bit weird to some people, but they trust him. And trust, it turns out, is an important thing. We see how it's the backbone of the family, but also how it's the backbone of the society. And that's what the Foxes have in Mosquito. They have a family, but they also have their own little society. And it can only really begin, it can only really be founded once Ali has, well, because Ali has the trust of his family, and once he also is able to kind of recruit the trust of his locals. He has to win that trust. Interestingly, he has to win it exactly the same way that Andre Gregory's character, the priest, has to win trust as well for a very different type of expedition. There's a bit of tug of war there, which turns out to be interesting. Religion is another recurring idea in this movie. Things end up being more balanced here than you might expect. This movie wasn't made by Richard Dawkins. Andre Gregory is really good in the film as a priest who is smug, but also experienced. There's an incredible twist toward the end of the movie. I won't spoil it, but when the foxes make their way to a mission and hear a sermon coming from the church, very interesting twist in terms of what they find inside. In a way, religion is allied with industrialism in this film. One of the things that the foxes are running from is industrialism, but believe it or not, it's also one of the things that they end up creating again in their own little society. This movie has dashes of a story like On the Silver Globe, where humans start again from scratch. They rebuild society, but end up rebuilding the same thing they had the first time around, end up running into the same issues. This kind of thing is, I think, actually pretty common in post-apocalyptic stories. It's a way for a post-apocalyptic story to try and reach out for some universal ideas about humans, right? Or for some truths about the society that we live in today, right? These movies are not about the future, they're about the present. Anyway, it's not really as simple as they've just duplicated everything, but there's a lot of subtle reversals in this movie that really keep you from pinning things down, that keep this from being didactic. Like the industrialization of the foxes, their little village, the unexpected civility of the mission, the places where violence crop up. Why would there be violence in this utopia? Alongside industrialization, another interesting piece of the movie is the nuclear anxiety, which is really sort of front and center for Ali. Like I said, he foresees upcoming nuclear catastrophe. This isn't really a didactic movie, but these fears aren't really proven out. Ali's forecasts of impending disaster are wrong. I'm not going to make any political statements here, but there have been a lot of incorrect prophecies about nuclear doom. Of course, on the other hand, nuclear energy does still feel like part of the end game of modernity, and I don't blame people for being anxious about it. But what is this anxiety really about? It's an interesting thing. In this movie, the Fox's ice machine, in some ways, turns out to be their own nuclear reactor, and its fate is their own nuclear meltdown. At the end of the day, it's hard to know. Will this movie make you feel like society is rock solid, indestructible, or like it's the opposite, like it's tenuous and could collapse at any second? Either way, I think it makes you realize how much of a miracle society, the one we have today, and the ones that people might found in the jungle, the ones we've created in the past, what a miracle that can be. The final thing to talk about is some of the colonial and racial aspects of the film. I think today some people might want this movie to have stronger anti-colonialism moralism in it, which it doesn't. Ali has kind of weird views in regard to globalism and internationalism. This is one of the first things you learn about his character. And yeah, he's really interested. Going to the jungle, he is really interested in offering people what he thinks is his own light. He doesn't care too much. He isn't particularly in tune with whatever people might already be doing there. Of course, he is genuinely trying to improve people's lives, and he goes out of his way to build trust. He tells the locals that he works for them, that they should tell him what to do, that if he needs to work harder, he will. On the other hand, he enlists them all to build out his plant civilization, to plant his crops and his plants. For some reason, he knows more about how to grow things in the jungle than the locals. Ali is a leader in some ways, and he does improve life for a period of time. Complicated storyline here. Today, we might try to read this from an anti-colonial viewpoint. I'm not sure if this is what Peter Weir was thinking about when he made the movie, and it's a little bit hard to map it onto it. Is this supposed to be Ali's naivete? Is it inevitably punished? Is there some symbiosis here? Hard to know. It seems like rather than any sort of didactic thing about who owns what land, the idea is more that the international world is bizarrely open, an oyster for all kinds of fraught journeys. This movie is kind of foregrounding the weirdness of this, I think, the weirdness of the international collision, rather than any, like I said, morals about who owns what. Given that Ali is kind of forward-thinking in some ways, it's interesting that he doesn't think too much about this angle. He's not thinking about anti-colonialism. He more or less sees the jungle as his to claim in some ways, not exactly to devour, but as an oyster. I guess it just wasn't as common in the 80s to be thinking about things the way that we would now. I don't know. Yeah, that's kind of an interesting piece of this. In some ways, the international feel of this movie reminds me a little bit of maybe even something like The Year of Living Dangerously, where we just get a really weird group of people living in Indonesia who are, just sort of coming together at the end of the world. It feels like this odd group of reporters intermixing with the locals. Like I said, Peter Weir may be interested in just how strange some of these international collisions are, not moralizing about it so much, but just seeing the kind of bizarre crossroads that the world can provide. Anyway, that's enough rambling, I think, about this movie, but that's The Mosquito Coast. Like I said, this is really a great movie. It's another triumph for Peter Weir. It's another very Peter Weir-like movie, accessible, and not exactly an art film, but it has a lot of subtlety to it, and it has some interesting themes, some big, strong undercurrents in it that the movie is not didactic about, but that gives you a lot of interesting angles to look at. On top of that, nice acting, compelling storyline. Think I gotta recommend The Mosquito Coast.